Welcome to another episode of the Finding Frequency podcast. In this episode, we're joined once again by Dayton Simenz, our head of research and product development here at Frequency. Today, we dive into the next badge in our series, Respiratory Health. We'll explore how optimizing your environment can lead to better breathing, increased calmness, and overall well-being. Dayton will share actionable insights and evidence-backed solutions to support your respiratory health right at home. Dayton, welcome back. Ready for another science corner as always.
I'm ready to roll.
Let's get it kicked off. So why don't you start by telling us what the respiratory system is?
Yeah, can do. I guess big picture, the respiratory system is basically responsible for collecting fuel for the cells from the air. It's responsible for collecting oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. And in a middle phase there's a layer of filtration. So basically, breathe in, collect as much oxygen as you can, bound to be some carbon dioxide, probably a few other chemicals in the air. Goes into the lungs. The lungs are responsible for filtering out those compounds into the, sending them to their proper places, because as we know, CO2, we don't really fuel with CO2. That's what we exhale. That's the waste that we produce. But then we kind of send the oxygen to the heart, send it throughout the body so that it can fuel our cells to function as well as possible.
Are there other attributes of air quality that we should be thinking about?
Yeah,
like CO2 or?
Absolutely. CO2, that's a big one. And that goes back to that cellular metabolism piece that I was talking about. Because the amount of CO2 in the air is basically, it's going to be inverse to the amount of oxygen or the concentration of oxygen. So high CO2 counts basically means you are consuming more CO2 and less oxygen per breath than you would in a lower CO2 environment, because they basically play as an inverse unless there's a weird third pollutant that's putting out some other compound that's irregular in air. But CO2 and oxygen, they dominate the airwaves usually. Those are the two compounds that exist. And you can measure CO2 really easily. I know you have a CO2 monitor. I know I really like mine. I care about it. Yeah.
Staring at me right now.
Yeah. I mean, a lead executive at Google, I believe is a co-founder, carried around a CO2 and air quality monitor with him everywhere that he went. Like if he was doing a talk in Toronto, he would have this monitor and place it on the desk where he talked. Same thing if he was in Saudi Arabia. But he thought it was that important, which makes sense because, I mean, 5 to 10% decrease in your cognitive abilities, that's going to have a major impact, especially if you're responsible for a big ship like Google. So Biome, that's an innovation that we use that is really neat. I think another one that, I don't know if it's an innovation outright, but it's an innovation in the spaces that we use is Sauna. There's the data on respiratory illness for those who sauna 4 times a week versus once a week is breathtaking. It's the common cold is down 60+%. Respiratory illness across the board down 50+%. So it is worth remembering that the environment that you're in has a huge part to do with your respiratory health. And it doesn't all have to be the pollutants that are in the environment. It's a huge piece. But obviously, having other aspects of your environment that support your health and well-being, it's only going to make your respiratory health better. So I'd say those are, yeah.
Giving great examples on what are we doing to mitigate the bad, and then what are we doing to support the good, like Biome and Sauna.
Absolutely. And that supporting the good is a big piece of it, because going back to that beginning note on the mitochondria and cellular health, the big metric, or a big metric that we can use to measure that, it's called VO2 max. So it's basically, it's the efficiency of your body's ability to perform sustained exercise at high intensities without switching to anaerobic metabolism. So it's very efficient with oxygen. And there are things like sauna. I think to some extent it does increase that ability because fighting off heat is naturally challenging. Basically, VO2 max it's a reflective of your cardiovascular and respiratory resilience. So how much stress can you take? And it's something that's very simple because the more stress that you give yourself and then you give yourself to recover, your body becomes more resilient. So in our spaces, sauna is great for that. The research on cold plunge is thin. It's a newer field that doesn't have as great of a body of research. But anecdotally, people find really positive responses from cold plunge as well with regards to kind of cellular and metabolic efficiency. And I think the simple one for people to just take home, and we do it in our buildings, we have stairs, but take the stairs. It's the simplest thing to give yourself just a little bit of cardiovascular and respiratory stress. And it's healthy. And what you find is the more steps you take, the better they're going to feel. And it's going to impact you positively across the board. There was a cool study. It was in an office that had basically encouraging stairs for their workers for 6 weeks. And they found 5 to 10% increases or improvements in body fat, cardiovascular output, VO2 max, basically everything that you would think of. And it was all just because people decided to take the stairs more often. So
what about some other things like I'm thinking about mold?
Sure.
What other environmental hazards? Maybe that's put that.
I think mold and CO, or I'll start with mold and then I'll get into VOCs because they're kind of a similar category, but mold interacts a different way, or at least you mitigate mold differently. So mold, the way that mold works, mold thrives in humidity and moisture. And the literal function of what happens is mold spores feed on basically moist environments, and then they will reproduce and shoot spores in the air. So those spores are pollutants that get caught in our lungs. People show mold exposure is correlated with a massive spread of health concerns.
Right.
And it's just kind of like the particulate matter piece. They're these really small particles, and because they're independently functioning and they are programmed to reproduce, there's the potential for them to wreak havoc in the right person who may have a compromised immune system, may not be geared to fight that system of mold. So mold, it's very unhealthy. Mitigating mold is pretty simple. Like general cleaning is a plus. Mold feeds on dust. It's not universally true, but that's one main food source that can encourage the growth of mold. So basically, humidity plus dust is bad for mold growth. So the ways to mitigate that are pretty simple. One is if you live in a humid environment, a dehumidifier it's really important. You want to maintain humidity between 40 and 60% most of the time. That's kind of the safe zone. Just anecdotally, I live in Wisconsin. Not most people would think of it as a tropical environment. It's not technically tropical. But right now, it's 85 degrees and 80% humidity here. And I have one air conditioning unit on each floor of my apartment. The bottom one is an in-window unit that it's naturally a dehumidifier. But the top it's one of these portable units that is a tube coming from the window. But everything that's happening is inside of my apartment. And because of that, it doesn't have an easy way to, you know how most window units drip water outside. Mine can't do that because it's all in my apartment. So I have a weird experiment where the top floor of my apartment, it doesn't remove the humidity. It's just getting the temperature down to where I set it. Whereas the bottom controls for humidity, and they're completely different environments.